Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. This is episode 294. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site, and Seth Cox is back after a week off. Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site. He is back on the air with me. Seth, we had a good show last week, honestly, but, I can't say that we can blame you because of the loss for not being on the show, because we lost when we were all on here before. So we don't blame it on you, but welcome back. Glad to kick off this new year. And on the show, unfortunately, poop. That happened. Poop happened.
Yeah, and it's just, it's good that we still have the show. It's good that we saw the improvement, and I think I had them at 8-8, so I guess good job by me. But it sucks that how they got to 8-8, because instead of finishing strong, they finished really, really poorly, and it became such an issue that we're getting absurdities now and things of that nature, and so it is the off season, and when you don't make the playoffs, it gives everybody time and the ability to create their own narratives and opinions on things, and we're seeing that kind of already unfold. And the way they finished the season, it's hard to expect people not to have that sour taste in their mouth and be upset, and maybe have a little hyperbole to everything that they're saying, because you start out at 5-2 and you wind up at 8-8. That means you went 3-6 down the stretch when it mattered, and I don't think anybody expected that. And now it's just a matter of we know. I shouldn't say we know. We're 99% confident that Kliff Kingsbury will be back. And so the question becomes, do they have what it takes to continue to build on this season and improve even more?
Right. So this edition of this episode is not quite an off-season show. This will be our end-of-season show. As everyone by now knows, the Cardinals did not make the postseason in that winner-go-home game. They went home. They lost to the LA Rams 18-7. It was ugly for much of the game, and we're going to talk about that. In this, we're going to talk about essentially that. What happened against the Rams. We're not going to delve really into off-season topics. We're going to save that for another show. So we're going to go end-of-season. What happened against the Rams? We're going to talk about the quarterbacking decision with Kliff Kingsbury, and the one little bit of offseason. How hot should Kliff Kingsbury's seat be at this point? And I know there are a number of people who would like to see him fired. Others want to see an established OC brought in. We'll talk about that. We'll grade the season overall, and then kind of do our end-of-season awards, kind of honor certain players, good and bad, and that's how we'll kick off the show. So let's start it off with the Rams game. They lose the game 18-7. It was honestly as bad as it could have been, even though things looked a little promising early. What were, first of all, just your impression of how John Wolford performed for the Rams?
Obviously he performed well enough to win. He's got some skills. They were woefully underprepared for his athleticism and running ability, which is, I think that's one of the more frustrating aspects of this whole thing, is that you've got Kyler Murray to practice against quite a bit. You can prepare for athletic quarterbacks, and to not be prepared for a guy like John Wolford, who's, clearly not as athletic as Kyler is. It stinks to have that be how they came out and played.
It does. Now, I will say my impression of Wolford is he wasn't bad. He wasn't good, but he wasn't bad. And I'm going to credit the Cardinals defense too. I think based on what we saw, I mean, you can't think the defense played badly, because they really did okay. They were fine. The defense wasn't the problem. Yes, Wolford made a few plays. You would have liked to have seen the defense overall frustrate him more. But overall, when you have a defense that keeps an offense completely out of the end zone for the entire game, 9 points is all that they give up. You can't be overall unhappy with that performance, because if you ask your defense, if you tell me that the defense is only going to allow 7 points, only 9 points, you expect to win that game. And so I wasn't unhappy with how the defense, obviously they could have, you would have liked to have seen them cause kind of a Blaine Gabbert, Nathan Peterman meltdown type thing. And I think that might have been a possibility if the Cardinals had done anything offensively after that first touchdown. But Sean McVay had them well prepared and had a very good game plan to protect Wolford. Now, Wolford made some plays, and it hurt the Cardinals at times. And I think as we've seen across the league, I think that happens with athletic quarterbacks to any defense, is that they do make some plays with their feet. And what he avoided was making mistakes. He avoided the turnovers for the most part, other than the first throw. And after that, they were able to protect him, and they were able to limit what they asked him to do. I thought the defense was fine. Ultimately, they needed the defense to be otherworldly when they lost Kyler. And the circumstances, but that just wasn't in the card. So I was impressed. I wasn't like wowed by John Wolford. The people are like, yeah, they've got a diamond in the rough. No. He was fine. He was okay. I had no problem with it. He's not going to be the leader of the Rams moving forward. He's not as good a quarterback as Jared Goff. But like we've seen with say like a CJ Beathard or Nick Mullins, when you are well coached in a good offensive scheme, like the Rams do have a good offensive scheme. They do have, as the 49ers do have a good offensive scheme. You get, lower tier quarterbacks who are able to look capable.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that gets missed a lot of times, and, we've talked about this a little bit before, but it's funny how teams try to find backup quarterbacks that fit what the offense is with the starter. And, to your point about him not being as good as Jared Goff, the Rams didn't seem to do that. The Rams seemed to take the approach of like, well, this kid's not Jared Goff, so he's, not going to deliver the same way that Goff would. So let's have a game plan in there that, it plays to his strengths and abilities. And it seems like more NFL teams should take that into consideration instead of what we typically see, which is a lesser version of the starting quarterback trying to run a similar offense. And I know we're not there yet, but I feel like that's what we saw from the Arizona Cardinals and Chris Streveler, is that they wanted to be able to run a similar offense to what they normally run. So they've got Streveler on there, and we all kind of saw what happened there. So, and it is what it is. Whereas the Rams were like, no, this is different. Like, the game plan's different. They still, scheme some of the same rollouts and easy throws that are just, part of the McVay offensive system, but they also schemed up a lot of run plays for him, a lot of design runs, and then gave him some freedom to scramble that Goff, doesn't actually have in his own ability. So it was interesting to see that, because it was this idea that we hear in the NFL all the time of like, well, your backup needs to be able to come in and, you not miss a beat on offense. And Sean McVay is almost like, well, that's not going to happen because there's not another Jared Goff out there. And, you and I probably disagree with that, but, that's their idea. And so it's like, let's have a guy that offers something different, that truly offers the team that they're playing a different look from what they typically would see. So your typical game plan, especially, defensively, is not really relevant to what they're running on game day.
Right. And for me, what happened the most is, I said this after the game. When you enter that game with Kyler Murray, even against that Rams, because that Rams defense can be just incredible. They've had some stinker of games too, but overall, when you look at how that defense, that's the number one defense in the league. They're elite against the pass. They're very good against the run. They're just really hard to do things against. And the defense over the last several weeks, even though they had lost 2 in a row, the defense had done their job. It was mistakes in the offense, mistakes by Jared Goff has kind of been plaguing them, their inability to do things offensively. So when you enter that game with John Wolford against the Cardinals defense, you felt confident, nervously confident is what I talked about last week in last week's show with Alex. I was nervously confident, or confidently nervous, one of the two, about that matchup, because even having Kyler Murray against the number one defense with the offense, you felt that the Cardinals had a good chance. Even if it's the two teams are completely healthy, you have a good shot and a good game, and you can win. You felt more confident because it was Wolford instead of Jared Goff, more confident because there's no Darrell Henderson, more confident there's no Cooper Kupp. But the second Kyler goes down, honestly, the Cardinals had no chance, because now you've got two basically equal quarterbacks. Only one has been able to prepare for a week and with the game plan, and the other did not. So they had a game plan for Kyler Murray, and you have the Wolford versus the Cardinals defense as opposed to Streveler versus an overwhelming Rams defense. The truth is, unless the Cardinals played a perfect game, they had no chance once Kyler went out. Because, honestly, this is what we talked about all year. Kyler Murray has covered up so many. It's like they have had success offensively, and it's been basically about Kyler Murray. When Kyler Murray has been great, they've been great. If he's been fine, they struggle more. And if he's showing his youth and inexperience, they look bad. If he's less than 100%, he's, we've seen Kliff Kingsbury kind of put some kind of throttle down some of the scheme or the kind of the game plan, trying to protect Kyler and his arm in what he does, and they're not nearly as impressive. And so the Cardinals had to be perfect. It started out, so Kyler gets hurt. They started perfect. Jordan Hicks gets the interception 2 plays later than the end zone. For me, things started, like, the one play that told me
this is not going to be good. Like this, I'm really worried. It was the safety. When they got that safety, that told me, because the Cardinals probably needed Strevler basically to give them one more touchdown drive. If they could have pulled that off in the first half, one more touchdown drive in the first half with Strevler, I think the Cardinals, they win that game. But it's 7-3, so the Rams had answered a little bit. Then the safety happens, and you're like, this is going backwards. Of course, the pick six happened after that. And that's the other thing. The Cardinals couldn't overcome Kyler or the fact that they didn't have Fitz or Christian Kirk. And then on top of that, the officiating wasn't the reason that they lost, but it was yet another obstacle because, that pick six shouldn't have happened.
Bad.
It was.
Yeah.
It was bad. I'm not going to criticize the offensive pass interference call too badly. That looked pretty offensive pass interferencing. But for one, that pick six never should have happened because it should have been a free play. Strevler should have taken better care of the ball. It's probably a ball he shouldn't have thrown, but the flag should have been thrown. It never should have happened. It should have been nullified. And then when Kyler Murray came in back in the game, DeAndre Hopkins was clearly interfered, so they should have had a 1st and goal and 1. I'm gonna feel that they score a touchdown in that, and it's either 18-13 or 18-15, and then it's a game late in the game, and we got some Kyler Murray magic. But without that happening, it was doomed, and they had the blocked field goal. The Cardinals couldn't overcome enough, and that's kind of been the thing. They're a good team when everything's rolling, when Kyler's playing well, but they can't overcome no Kyler and then other obstacles on top of that.
Right. And so, you look at it and they've, obviously had some issues. The officiating, that back judge was in his feelings for the game. Obviously he was upset that he felt disrespected by DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins felt like he's an idiot and he deserves the disrespect. The fact that he, that he seemed to bite his whistle on that showed that he's, unfortunately was just still hurt from, DeAndre Hopkins was wrong in the wrong.
He had a meltdown. He made,
you don't flip off an official, like whether or not. Okay, I'll say this: you don't flip off an official in the second quarter of a football game.
Yeah, you should never do it ever. Honestly, it should never happen.
Right. But if you're gonna do it, like probably use some better judgment on like, hey, this is not, a critical time in the game or my team's not. Like, I get it. He's a competitor. He was upset. He let his emotions get the best of him. All of that stuff happens. We all let our emotions get the best of us. But he made the decision to flip off the official. Now, that being said, the official absolutely was never going to give him a call after that. And, that was the back judge's call on that, what was obvious pass interference. And he's like, oh, so now you want me to, and that's unfortunate. But it's the NFL and it happens and you can't do anything about it. You and I can't do anything about it. So we just kind of move on and hope that they don't put themselves in that position again. But yeah, the officiating was poor, and it typically is exacerbated when you have it, when there's obvious calls and your team needs a call. That's one thing I always say to fans is like, the obvious missed calls happen when your team desperately needs a call and can't get one. And I think, you and I would agree that the Cardinals desperately needed a call.
They needed something to go their way. And they didn't get any help. Like, imagine this. If if that neutral zone infraction is called, that offsides is called, so that takes off 7 points on the board. So 11-7.
And it might put up.
Well, and they might put points on the board. Honestly, they might put points on the board. If they, I'm like, whatever. If they don't, just changing that, it does change how desperate they are later in the game. 1 and 2, once Kyler comes in, if nothing else changes otherwise, that pass interference in the end zone then puts them in a position, if they gets called, to then take a 14-11 lead.
Yeah, and so that's that's the hard part, and like we said, it is what it is. But they, offensively, they just struggled to find any rhythm all game, and it's kind of goes back to what you and I've talked about, and we'll get into quite a bit this offseason. It's just the addition of DeAndre Hopkins was a massive one, and I don't think anybody would disagree with that, but it wasn't enough. The addition wasn't enough to put them over the top. And it became more and more obvious either when Kyler was hurt and, like you said, they had to throttle down the offense, or, in this game when he's out and there's literally nobody else that can make a play. Because, they're taking away DeAndre Hopkins with one of the better cornerbacks in the NFL. And so, all of a sudden you've got Jalen Ramsey taking away DeAndre Hopkins, and yes, Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald were gone, but Kenyon Drake's there, Dan Arnold's there. Those other guys that are supposed to be, that have been lobbied as game changers are there, and they're not producing in any way. And that, is kind of what you and I have talked about with this whole they need more weapons thing. Is it's not that their weapons are awful. But they're basically elevated in their play, and it's all of them, not just one or two of them. Outside of Hopkins, they're all elevated in their play by Kyler Murray. And so when you look at the team in general, and like you said, Murray goes down, they just didn't have the offensive line. The offensive line wasn't in the same space they were this time last year when Brett Hundley took them up to Seattle and won a game. They just weren't playing as well. And quite frankly, like you said, that Rams defense with Aaron Donald's a really hard team to play against. Because one, Aaron Donald's the best defensive player alive. But two, they've got an excellent secondary, which makes life hard on any quarterback, but especially a quarterback kind of, I know it wasn't a start, but like making his first basically start and real appearance of his NFL career.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, we're going to talk about the quarterbacking decisions that they made. Chris Streveler, Brett Hundley inactive. It was a question that came up because of Murray's injury. So that's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Under fire, the decision to keep Brett Hundley inactive came under fire by media members. Well, it was question. It wasn't something. I will say this: it was a question that was asked. A fair question. Kliff Kingsbury stood by the decision. Fans went bonkers. Fans went bonkers because of the result of that game. Okay, I'll give my thoughts, and if you tell me, do you think Hundley should have been active? And if so, if not, would there be a scenario that makes sense? And if so, it's just kind of, what is your take to the people saying Brett Hundley should have been active on that game day instead of Chris Streveler?
I don't think it should have been instead of. I think for the last several weeks, from, week 11, so week 12 and on, Hundley probably should have been active on game day because of Kyler's injuries. And if you've got your best player injured, you probably don't want to just hand over the reins to Chris Streveler and say, well, here we go. Because I have no doubt that they probably make a play or change things up coming out of halftime or maybe midway through the third quarter when the offense continued to be stagnant and give Hundley a look if he's active. That's my only thing, is that it has less to do with Streveler and more to do with the fact that we've known Murray was injured and hurting at this point, and I know it was an injury that had nothing to do with the previous ones. It's just, I like to be careful in those situations, and I thought, they didn't do that.
I have zero problem with the two quarterbacks, because if you look at the practice, if we look at the Cardinals over the last several years, the only time, even dating back to BA, when Bruce Arians had three quarterbacks active, it was only because the quarterback, their starter wasn't 100% or the backup wasn't 100%. And so they would have just in case. And Kliff in this case, the leg injury, I'm more convinced that they called it a leg and just kept it that way. But, when he said that he got hit in the right place, that tells me it wasn't really a leg injury. And it probably was he got hit in the nuts or rolled up in the nuts, something, and then the private parts. And so there wasn't any fear of that. So they determined he was completely healthy. If he's 100%, you don't need a third quarterback active on game day, because that's just...
It's superfluous.
Right. It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't. And if you look at, if you're going to question it in week 17, why didn't you question it on any of the other weeks? Because Hundley hasn't been active at all season. Now, Cardinals have been fortunate in the fact that Murray has essentially played every snap this year and didn't need Streveler and those other things. And so I don't have a problem with that, and I don't have a problem with him trusting Streveler either. Here's the thing. For the people who think that Hundley would have been a better option, I'm going to point to last year. Yes, we saw him play poised. We saw him in 2019 preseason. He looked good, and when he came in Seattle. But I will say that it was a completely different situation, because Hundley came in and was protecting a lead. And so, and if you remember that game in Seattle, they did not ask Hundley to really do anything with his arms at all. They had a lead, and so they leaned on the running game. He had played 32 snaps and threw 9 passes. Now, I believe he had 6 running attempts. 3 or 4 of those might have been on initial dropbacks, but even say went from 9 pass attempts to 13 pass attempts in 32 plays. That's still quite run heavy, and that was not what they were. That was not the situation that Streveler put in. And I would dare say I don't think we could have expected much different a result than what we saw from Streveler. And I'm going to go to the next part. Is this okay? You've got the guy in Kliff Kingsbury who has been clear, and Streveler has been ahead of Hundley dating back to training camp. He's been ahead of him. I thought initially when Streveler made the roster and Hundley was inactive in week 1, it had to do with his game day flexibility, play special teams, this and that, packages here and there. But when they didn't use him, the packages made very clear that, and Kliff Kingsbury has said all along, he's a quarterback. So people saying he was going to be a Taysom Hill weren't listening to Kliff. Kliff has said he's definitely a quarterback. He played 1 special team snap all year. I don't even remember. I didn't catch when that was. He played 1 snap on special teams. And I felt that perhaps if Kyler during the week, you knew he was going to be out, that they might have turned to Brett Hundley. And it became more and more evident that Streveler, for whatever reason, was ahead of Hundley. He was ahead of him based on Kliff Kingsbury said he's made plays. He's handled himself better. So whatever that means about Hundley, Streveler had earned that. And so, but this is the same quarterback that we've trusted to develop Kyler Murray, to then question his quarterback decision with another guy that he thinks highly of in Streveler and the skill set that he's got. He was put in an impossible situation. Like I already said, I felt that it did. Once Kyler Murray went down, you were basically that game was basically lost to begin with if he was going to be out more than a series or two, because it was going to require a perfect game. And after that safety, it wasn't perfect anymore. And so I have zero problem with that. Hundley, I believe Hundley was mainly only on the roster because his contract was like 90% guaranteed. And there was still, like, even if he didn't play, having a third quarterback on the roster, that way he didn't have to, there wasn't anyone on the practice squad. They didn't need to burn up a practice squad spot for him. He, being a veteran who's played behind some great quarterbacks, still has value even if he's not playing, or even if you don't trust him over Streveler to play. So I have zero problems with how that played out, because, and I don't even think Streveler played badly. He had, he waited too long to run on that safety play. Pugh got manhandled. He made a mistake in the end zone. He just can't have that happen. He should have made a decision more quickly, and he shouldn't have thrown a pick six, but then again, the pick six shouldn't have been a pick six. So other than that, I think Streveler was fine. He was what you could have expected from any backup against that defense. Well, any backup against that defense coming in cold during the game, as opposed to having a week to prepare.
Right. A week to prepare makes it a little different. So, and that's the other thing is it's going to be compared, and it makes sense, but at the end of the day, let's be completely honest. The Cardinals defense is a middle of the road defense at best, and the Rams defense is one of the 5 best in the NFL.
Right.
So again, you're just talking about, two different teams and two different abilities. Like Wolford had all day or all week to get ready for the Cardinals defense. Took all the snaps in practice, was ready to go. And meanwhile, Streveler, like you said, had to come in and basically they asked him to perform a miracle.
Right. So I look at it this way. I see Streveler and Wolford as basically equals. And so if you look at them in terms of equals at the quarterback position, you then look at the scenario that they're in. Wolford had a week to prepare for an okay defense. Streveler had no preparation for the best defense and was thrown into the fire cold immediately with, he just had to make do. They were surviving. It started well, but it wasn't like, unless the defense could have created another turnover or two, or they play mistake-free offensively, if they could have done something on the ground, it would have been nice. They were doomed. They were doomed, and I accept that. Honestly, I accept that.
Yeah, and that's where it ended up being, if we're, being honest about everything. They needed their defense to outplay the Rams defense, and I guess, unfortunately, that was just never going to happen.
Coming next on the Rise Up C Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk a little. Let's move on. We're going to talk about Kliff Kingsbury, his future. People want him fired. How hot should his seat be right now and moving forward? That's coming next on Rise Up C Red. We're back on the Rise Up C Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Kliff Kingsbury coming under fire. Year 2, like I will say, I'm going to describe this year, and I'll talk a little bit more of this in a little later when we talk about grading the season. Big picture, if you, based on what we thought was happening before the season, you probably feel okay with it. I'm going to describe it in 3 ways. It went from hopeful to promising to disappointing. Now, Kliff Kingsbury now comes under fire because you took a 5-2 team and a 6-3 team and made it an 8-8 team. And ultimately, while it did come down to that final game, even though they lost, you can look back at the schedule and now lament particular losses. You can lament the Lions game where both sides of the ball played well enough to win, and Kyler Murray's 3 interceptions did them in. You look at the Patriots game where Zane Gonzalez misses that game-winning kick, and then special teams makes mistakes and they lose that game. You look at the Carolina game where they had no answer for them because they were missing Budda Baker. They had problems in the secondary. You look at the Miami game as well, and how things played out. And so you've got 3-4 games, and then obviously the Week 16 game against the 49ers when, that was just bad. One win somewhere out of those games they should have won. They're in the postseason. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what happens in Week 17. Now, I will say this. They finished 2-4 in the division. There's a problem. I've always been of the opinion if you don't go 3-3 in the division, you don't make the playoffs. That's pretty much like, to me, if you can't go 500 in your division, you're not going to make a wild card, and if you don't go 4-2, you're not going to win the division.
Well, and it was something we talked about, and it honestly was one of those situations where we talked about this quite a bit and understood that what had to happen for this team to make the playoffs. And one of the things that we talked about was they had to be 3-3 in the division. And I think that's another thing that you kind of lament at this year is you started the season 2-0 in the division. So you were on pace. So you finished up, 3-6, but more importantly, or worse off, you finished up 0-4 in the division. And I think that was kind of what the big problem ended up being, is that this team there was never a consistency about it. And when that happens, that's the result that you end up with, is that you end up being a team that looks back and goes, oh, well, this is what I missed.
So go ahead.
Oh, no. And so to that, and I was going to, kind of, I don't know. I mean, obviously the people that listen to this are NFL fans. So I'm assuming they know what's going on with the New York Giants and how, everybody's up in arms. The Giants are up in arms that they didn't make the playoffs at 6-10, which, by the way, they were an awful team. But the Giants, like the Cardinals, had their opportunities and they blew them. And at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to, is that when you have your opportunities, you have to find a way to take advantage of them and not blow them. And just, unfortunately, the Cardinals blew their opportunities to make the playoffs this year.
It's true. Riffing onto that part of the Giants, who cares what you think about Doug Peterson's decision with the Eagles late in that game? Once you relinquish control of your destiny when it comes to the playoffs, you also relinquish the ability to criticize other teams and how they handle it. When you don't take care of your business to get in the playoffs, you can't be mad. You can't honestly be that mad about another team messing it up for you because you weren't in control of things anyway. So even if, for example, the Eagles as an organization decided, we don't like the Giants. We really don't want them in the playoffs because a 6-10 team winning our division is stupid. So we're going to essentially let Washington win. It doesn't matter. You cannot like that, but when you don't have control of your playoff destiny, you can't say anything. So Doug Peterson his team was already eliminated. He can choose to manage the game how he wants. He wanted to choose to use the fourth quarter to give, Nate Sudfeld some reps, like a preseason game. He is able to do that. Yeah, it's maddening as a fan. But at the same time, it's not, Jalen Hurts wasn't being great, and he felt that Sudfeld deserved some playing time. So why not try to win with this other guy and give him a shot to get some more tape on him? So that's a decide that. Now let's bring it back to Kliff. One, what do you say to fans who believe he should be fired? Do you agree at all that there is a scenario in which he should be fired even after 2 years?
I said this on Twitter. Before the last 2 weeks, I was never an advocate of firing Kliff, because I think that he's done what we had hoped and kind of expected to be the growth of this team. But and the way that they were prepared the last 2 weeks to play was, I think, what the concern becomes. Because that was a team that didn't look prepared to make the playoffs. It didn't look like a team that looked like it was ready to compete at a high level. And instead, it looked like a team that it looked closer to the Steve Wilkes Cardinals than it did the Kliff Kingsbury Cardinals. And that was, I think, what made me go, you know what, if they fire him, they fire him. I wouldn't openly advocate it, but how bad they played those last 2 games, I think told us, has me more concerned than I was 3 weeks ago.
Understandable. Now, here's my take on this. So, there is only one scenario in which Kliff Kingsbury should be fired. Now, I do not advocate this at all. I think when you look at big picture, for the most part, I believe people are clouded. People's view is being clouded by the finish, which is a very short-term view. And if you look at big picture, where they started, what Kingsbury did accomplish with this team, from year 1 to year 2, they went from awful to not good but promising to in control of things and then have it fall apart. But ultimately, kind of what were, I think, what was reasonable expectations. Now, as a team, as an organization, you are pushing for the playoffs, and I believe Kyler still believes that they were a playoff team. They made mistakes themselves. And Kliff believed that they were good enough to push to the playoffs. But if you look at overall expectations, they were a team that, if any team, and us included, no fan should have reasonably believed that entering this season they were a lock for the playoffs. That at best they could have made the playoffs, but you expect them to compete, be in the mix for the playoffs, and that's exactly what we got for them. So it's hard to take a coach and say, we want to see growth, we want to see competitiveness, and see that, okay, you've done exactly sort of what was expected of you, and then pull the plug. I get that with Steve Wilkes, Bidwill knew really early that he wasn't the right. And I didn't even, I've been on the show, and I said I didn't necessarily agree with cutting ties with Wilkes. Now, obviously, within the organization, they had major concerns about whether he was the right guy after the fact. But you've done what you can. Now, you go into year 3 with, okay, that's a mental note. Okay, we have some issues with preparation. The team doesn't look prepared. So you've got those red flags, but you've got to give them another year. And here's the thing. If you were definitely convinced that Kliff is not the guy, Steve Keim better not survive. Now, he can't survive another coach because
No,
it
you
just
can't.
doesn't. He shouldn't have. In my opinion, he never should have survived the Wilkes firing.
No, and that's the thing is, somebody asked me why I would be okay with Kliff being fired, and my response was because I would assume that meant that Steve Keim was getting fired. Now, if you say to me that, if you fire Kliff, then Keim is gone, I'm actually more open to listen to that conversation. But the reality is, I don't think Kliff is going anywhere, and I think he deserves another year to continue to build. If they had, and trust me, the last 2 weeks were steps back. There's zero question about that to anybody.
But they were ahead of schedule, so we've talked about that. They were ahead of schedule of their progress, and so
Right.
they just
And
stepped back to expectations.
where they should have been, or what we expected of them. But they took steps this season that we wanted to see, and so now they're to the point, or they're close to where you feel like there's a chance that they can take it to the next level next year.
And next year, this is where you know whether Kliff is the guy or not. Do they maintain or improve, or do they take a step back? If they take a step back, I understand moving on from him. Now, there's a practical reason. Now, I think at this point we know, because Kliff gave his post-season press conference. That doesn't happen if they're going to fire him. So we know he's sticking around because the last 2 firings, okay? So we go back to the Whisenhunt firing. It was made known the night before, or it was quiet as to what media availability was going to be. They released that after that evening, that Kliff was going to be available to talk to me the next day. There wasn't any change. So this was always going to happen. Same thing happened with Wilkes. It was hush, 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 and then a press conference announced with Michael Bidwill. And so you knew what was happening there. And even with Bruce Arians, now, since he retired, it was a normal media availability with that. So you look at firings and how the Cardinals had handled that. He's not getting fired. Now, I'm going to bring the next question. So, there was, again, I was saying the practical reason is, I'm sure Bidwill, there's a couple of reasons why you don't pull the plug at this point. One is just the practicality of, as an owner, is the fact that in 2021, he's still paying Steve Wilkes 1 more year. So if you fire Kliff, so then you're paying Wilkes, you're paying Kingsbury, and whoever new coach you're trying to get in. That's not a good business practice. And while they were willing to pull the plug on Wilkes, they were willing to do that because they weren't paying anyone else. That was an easy thing to do. He was a relatively cheap head coach, and they replaced him with a relatively cheap head coach overall. And so and whoever you're going to bring in is probably, unless you go the unproven or the hot commodity coordinator, you're probably forking out more money. So that's a practical reason. But the other one is this, and that's why pull the plug on progress with your quarterback when you shouldn't be certain that Kliff isn't the guy. He might not be the guy. That's you can never know when you hire a coach if he's going to be the guy to bring you a championship. You hope. With Wilkes, they were convinced early that he wasn't going to be. But after 2 years of Kliff Kingsbury, you can't really say that he's definitely not the answer. And you've already built this team around having him plus Kyler Murray. Don't pull the plug yet. And then essentially, unless you bring in someone you absolutely trust is going to make them a Super Bowl contender in 2021, good luck with that. You've wasted the development and set them back a little bit unless the upside is incredible when you've got this rookie contract at quarterback. So now here, let's bring to the other question. So the other thing fans are really crawling for now is he needs to have someone. He needs a veteran OC or a veteran play caller to help him out offensively. Let's get your take, because I'm not necessarily in that camp, just because, for a number of reasons. What is your answer to fans, or your take on the fact that people want the Cardinals to hire a veteran OC, an offensive coordinator, to kind of take the load off of Kliff?
I don't think that there needs to be anything taken off of Kliff, but I have thought all along that they've not done enough or surrounded Kliff quite enough with good veteran coaches to kind of help him along the way. I don't, there's not anything that I would want them to do necessarily. I look at a guy like Anthony Lynn, and I feel like he could be a good type of a foil to Kliff. But Lynn struggled with a lot of stuff as a head coach that Kliff struggles with. So it's not like you're going to get a guy in here honestly, that's what the problem is Lynn would be a good type of guy in the sense of, he's got a good voice and he's respected as a offensive mind in the NFL, that could probably help Kliff out in certain areas. But a lot of his struggles, like I said, were areas similar to Kliff. And I've talked about this before, and I don't like bringing this up because I feel like as soon as you mention names, people just automatically go, well, you're saying that he's going to have this type of career. And this is not what I'm saying about Kliff at all. One, Kliff hasn't had a winning season in forever, at college or the pro level. So that's, that's a reality of the situation. But when you look at a guy like Andy Reid dealt with, for years in Philadelphia, the jokes and the kind of the mocking of his inability to manage the clock, to manage late game situations, blunders and blunders and blunders. Again, I'm not saying that's who Kliff is going to be. I don't want anybody to get that idea. But, that was what people thought of Andy Reid. You look at a guy like Kyle Shanahan, who everybody seems to love. Remember, he's blown as an offensive play caller 2 massive leads in the Super Bowl. 2-score leads. I mean, the one was a 4-score lead in the Super. Yeah, in the Super Bowl. So and I don't, and so again, I'm not saying Kliff is on those guys' level, but the follies of Kliff, the shortcomings of Kliff, the complaints of Kliff are all warranted, but I think a lot of them come with time spent honing your craft and learning as you go. The unfortunate thing is that we just don't have that opportunity anymore in the NFL, because it's so much of a win now league, and the turnaround for so many franchises is so quick that you see them, go from being awful to competing in a year or two. And so I think that's what Kliff is going to have to overcome. I think he deserves the chance to do so. If they feel like a guy, like I said, like an Anthony Lynn or like a sage veteran, like a Wade Phillips type, but obviously on offense, could come in and help him. I just don't know what name you're going to throw at me that I'm going to say, oh yeah, that guy could definitely help Kliff Kingsbury.
Well, and you look at when Kingsbury was hired, they interviewed a ton of offensive coordinator possibilities. The problem that you're running across is, hey, Kliff's supposed to be a dynamic offensive mind. There are some questions about his play calling, absolutely, and there's a number of reasons that could be for. But to just say you're going to bring a guy in to call plays, they interviewed guys like Bob McAdoo, Steve Sarkisian came up. First of all, the offensive system that Kliff, so to bring someone in, it's got to be someone who is willing to work with that offensive system. Two, if he is, they interviewed several veteran guys to be offensive coordinator, and it just wasn't the right fit. Honestly, it wasn't the right fit for Kingsbury right now. Now, the name that we remember we felt probably was a good fit was Jake Spavital, who took the Texas State job. And he ended up not taking the offensive coordinator job because he got a head coaching job in college, which makes sense. So Spavital would be a fantastic because you bring in a guy who can be another sounding board within the same system. Kugler's been really good with that, at least in the run game, but to get another one, but it can't be another alpha. That's the thing. It can't be another alpha to Kingsbury, and you can't just say, Kliff, don't call plays because, hey, look what they did in year 2 with him calling plays. They were a top 5 offense after going from historically bad to pretty good to top 5 offense in the league, and that's even with struggles late in the year. To tell him he has to hand off play calling to someone else is a slap in the face and is ignoring the progress that they made. So the only scenario I see, you can't just say they need a veteran. They need, if they're going to bring in a veteran, it's got to be someone that can come in and work with something like that. What would be a really fun one to have would be someone like Mike Leach or one of the guys who are kind of like what BA did with Tom Moore, is to bring an old school college genius with the air raid to be his offensive mentor, which would be different because they don't have the experience in the pros. But if you're going to bring in an offensive coordinator, it's got to be someone who can work with Kliff and his system that Kliff trusts. It can't feel like you're undermining him or saying to him that he doesn't do the right job. It's just saying, we want someone else with you that you like.
Right. And so that's where I'm at with the whole situation. If you find a fit for Kliff, I'm okay with it, but don't just go get a guy to say, oh, we got a guy. And I think too often that's what people, that's their knee jerk reaction. And instead it's like, no, that's not what it should be about. So, we'll see what happens and where they're at. And kind of how they decide to go about Kliff in his plays, the final, in what could be, his, I don't want to say his final season, but, a make or break season for him.
I agree. Coming up next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, or in this case, it's going to be more than an hour of Cards talk on the web. We're going to come back and talk about the season in general. Time to grade the season, talk about both sides of the ball. Not too much, but let's come back, talk season grades. Coming on next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise of Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's talk. We'll pull it back. It's not about Kliff. It's not about individual players. Let's grade this season. We have now had a few days to decompress from the disappointment of that loss. But let's look big picture. I am a patient person. I'm a patient man. I'm a patient fan when you build something. I have a hard time with the changing guards and changing philosophies quickly. I think a lot of what happens in the NFL is incremental progress isn't bad. I know people want, and I'm definitely not like Super Bowl or bust. True fans need to be Super Bowl bust. Then you're always unhappy. You're just an unhappy fan all the time. I like to be optimistic. I like to believe that there is a hope and that, I'm good with a team. Even though, it was disappointing. 2015, 2016, that was the year when you're like, they should make the Super Bowl. 2014, when they, ended up with Ryan Lindley and starting in the playoffs, that was the year you're like, you should have done it, and it was disappointing. But honestly, as a fan, you should be happy overall, for the most part, with a team that is competitive and in the mix for the full year. Because there's never guarantees. But that said, let's talk about how would you grade it overall? We'll talk grade the offense, the defense, special teams, and then coaching overall before we move on to the next segment. What grade would you give this season?
I'd give it I think a B minus. It was close to, I think you could say a C plus or a B minus. If they would have probably finished in the playoffs, I think you would have given it a B, and then if they made a run, obviously that changes it. But I think when you look at it, there were too many issues still to give it a higher grade. And I think that they still have too much growth needed in all aspects to grade it much higher than a B minus or a C plus.
I'm going to say solid C. And there was a post on one of the USA Today sites that graded every NFL team, and they gave the Cardinals C. I completely agree. I say it's a solid C because, I'm going to use the what I said earlier. This is a season you can describe in three words. It went from hopeful to promising to disappointing. Because hopeful of being competitive, promising, they were in position to not only, when they started the season 5-2, you're like, this team could make a run because the way they were playing, so they could have been not necessarily go on a run like the Finers did last year or the Bills did this year, but to have that sort of impact and to be that sort of competitive team. They were playing at an A level then. Then things sort of went disappointing, and that's where you have to look at the end of the season kind of like bombing your finals after you had, a 95% in the class. You were acing everything to start the year, and then you just sort of fell off. You missed some school, and at the end you bomb your final. I give it a solid C because it hit right overall. It hit right where you kind of hoped they would be, but it was disappointing in how it ended. I give it a solid C. Let's go offense. How would you grade the offense overall in this season?
I would say probably a C. I think we saw improvement from Kyler. I think we saw the importance of adding DeAndre Hopkins, and I thought we saw improvement in terms of statistical numbers on the offensive line and pass protection. I thought the running game took a step back this season. I thought that no player made the leap into becoming the number 2 player on this offense, and that was an issue. And so I thought you had, a great year, an all-pro year from Hopkins, a very good year from Murray, with room to grow, and then I don't know how many other people you would grade as, better than average.
I'm a little more forgiving. I'm going to give it a B to B minus. You did have some in like overall. You have a quarterback who was on the verge of who had nearly 4,000 would have had 4,000 yards passing if he doesn't get hurt in the finale. He had over 800 yards, lots of the score is 37 total touchdowns. What is it on the season? You had over 1,300 yards from DeAndre Hopkins. They were on pace to have 1,000-yard running back, and then with Chase Edmonds was flirting with the idea of 1,000 total yards from scrimmage. They became a top 5 offense. And so overall, you'd say the growth they made was very good. The end of the season clouds that overall, and that they did that production, like you said, without really anyone. Like Dan Arnold did exactly what we thought Dan Arnold would do. 31 catches. He made some plays, but he became exactly what we thought he could be maxed out, essentially. Christian Kirk was wildly inconsistent. Fitz had the lowest production of his entire career. Andy Isabella went from promising to playing 3 snaps when there were 2 receivers out. Keyshawn Johnson was better at the end. Chase Edmonds was a bit of a revelation in terms of but his impact because of injuries late in the season kind of hampered him. So I give it BB minus. Overall, I'm a little more forgiving because if you look at the overall production. Defensively, what do you think of them?
I would give it a B. I thought they overcame a lot of, they didn't get a lot of production from their big signings that they had hoped in Jordan Phillips and Devon Kennard, and obviously they had the injury to Chandler Jones. They had a plethora of injuries. So if I kind of graded it by position group, I would say the defensive line was a C, and probably closer to a C plus, just because of the attrition that they dealt with all season. I thought the linebackers were a B. The safeties were, a B plus or an A minus, and then the corners were probably a D. So that may not average out to a B, but I think that's about right where they would be.
And I'd give them a B overall as well if you look at the overall improvement from what they had a season ago. They went from a dumpster fire defense to a defense that was playing at a really high level early on. It tapered down, but by the end of the year, they were, if you're losing football analytics, I think Kyle Odegaard cited that they were number 6 in a key passing defense metric, which is pretty impressive. And that was, and that's when you felt that Patrick Peterson took kind of a step back overall in his play. You lose Chandler Jones. You don't get the production on the defensive line that you thought you were going to get. And Jordan Hicks wasn't as good this year. So overall, the defense was improved. The defense did what it needed to do. They did have some hiccups, but if you look at the year-long performance, you saw improvement in a lot of areas, and they did it in the face of some injuries. Special teams. I'm going to give this one, while they did get overall solid play in the punt game, and overall they were quite good in the coverage game, the problems they were impactless in the return game, as they have been for, it seems, years, since Ted Ginn's year. And then the problems in the kicking game in that mid-range and in clutch kicks, I see that's a C minus at best.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The kicking game alone, you could probably move it down to a D. So it's unfortunate that this was a that this was a problem this year, because in the end you could look at special teams and say that legitimately cost them 1 or 2 games this season.
Coaching, if you want to look at the job that Kliff Kingsbury did, I think I'm gonna give him what I gave the team, and it's solid C. It was kind of at expectations. He exceeded expectations and then fell below expectations late in the year. I'm one of my contributors, Brock Holton. He wrote an interesting piece that researched kind of Kliff Kingsbury is bad at finishing seasons. That's something to look at next year. Obviously, in college, it's a little different. That's when you're playing your conference games. But we've seen the last 2 years where his teams tend to falter late. That's something to look at for 2021. What would you give Kliff overall, like the overall coaching?
I would say he was a C this year. He was average. He had some really highs. He had some bad lows, and that's what happens, and that's how you get to be average. And the Cardinals were kind of the definition of average this year.
Coming up next on the Rise Up C Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk, and we're going to talk about the last segment, and that is where we're going to talk about kind of our hyperboles for the team. So kind of our awards, recognitions, and not all of them are good awards. So we're going to give the team honors for what they did this year. That's coming on next on Rise Up C Red. We're back on the Rise of C Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk of the whim. Time for our yearly hyperboles in this end of season show. If you had to pick a team MVP overall, do you take Kyler or do you take DeAndre?
I would take DeAndre. It's easier to say Kyler because of you see the importance in the value, so to speak, of the quarterback position when he's not out there. But I thought that Hopkins' performance and his ability to elevate this year was truly the difference in this season, and is why this team had a chance to compete for a playoff position. I don't know how much different Kyler's numbers are without him, but I do know that this team wouldn't have won as many games.
I'm gonna give Kyler. I'm gonna be the coward here. I'm gonna give Kyler the MVP because of because basically when he was great, the team was great. If he wasn't great, the team, kind of the way he went, the team went. So he was, to me, their most important piece of that team. But then I'm gonna cheat the other way, and I'm gonna give DeAndre Hopkins the Offensive Player of the Year.
Yeah, and I would flip it, and I would say Kyler was the Offensive Player of the Year, because I thought you saw that the offense stagnated without him. He ended up giving Kenyon Drake so much of his running room, and when Kyler wasn't running well, Kenyon didn't run well. It's not like he picked up the slack, and I think that he's the most important player on the offense, but I thought that DeAndre was the most valuable player on the team.
Defensive Player of the Year for you. I'm not sure which way to go with this. I'm gonna lean towards Buda Baker, though I really did give Hassan Reddick a thought. But you got to go with the Pro Bowl All-Pro. I think Buda Baker is their Defensive Player of the Year. One of them, maybe not necessarily so much Defensive Player of the Year. He's definitely the defensive MVP.
Yeah, and I was going to give it to Hassan. I thought his performance this year, with literally no other pass rushers. I mean, Marcus Golden's been nice, but with no other pass rushers, to have a career year, to come out and play as well as he did and make the impact that he did as a pass rusher and as an overall player in the game, I think he was the defensive MVP, because we got what we expected from Buda Baker. which is an MVP like numbers, but I think that what Hassan did was kept this defense afloat and made it better than we expected.
And I'm going to give Hassan my most improved because holy cow, he proved to me like I liked moving him to the edge. I had major concerns about him being a full-time player. He not only became a situational pass rusher, they trust him on every down, and fantastic. I think it's going to be really hard to keep him. And I wrote the piece the other day. He called it a smart business move, and I understand. This is just hindsight. I am not critical of the decision to not exercise that fifth-year option, but man, that would be super nice to have about right now because, honestly, he was going to enter the year as the third pass rusher. He was going to be a situational guy at best, so you probably could have seen maybe 5 to 7 sacks in a best case scenario. He turns into an every down player, a legitimate pass rushing force. Fantastic, most improved, and he's probably going to go get himself bags and bags of cash. Who's your most improved?
I think Hassan's the right pick, but I'm going to actually give it to DJ Humphries. I think Hump went from
Good
being
pick.
A good offensive lineman to being one of the 5 best left tackles in the NFL this year. That's how good he was. And so for him to make that improvement in year one of his new deal, we can lament a lot of things, but the pick by Steve Keim and the grooming by Kliff Kingsbury and Sean Kugler has, paid dividends.
For me, the best new addition, so I'm not talking rookie, but the best new addition to the team, early on, I thought that Devondre Campbell was going to run away with that. And I had high hopes for Devon Kennard. I was bullish on his potential this year. For me, it's Kelvin Beachum. The lockdown play overall from their tackle positions was really important. And Beachum became a super important signing, a very fortunate signing, especially once Marcus Gilbert went down, and then you weren't forced to play Josh Jones as a rookie.
Yeah, and I think Beachum's a good pick. I think a guy, obviously, DeAndre Hopkins is an easy pick.
Oh, yeah, God, come on.
But
that's the way I should have done.
No, and I'm trying not to give the same guys, and I think Hopkins is the obvious one, but a guy I wanted to go a little off the grid on this one, just because this unit was so bruised and battered all season, and I thought he did a really nice job. He's not great. Let's be honest, but I thought he had a nice enough season. I thought Angelo Blackson was a huge pickup for the team. He ended up being probably their most consistent defensive lineman, which is not, and I don't mean to laugh about it, but it's,
considering literally, even we follow the NFL, we follow the Cardinals. When they claimed him off waivers, I was like, who?
Yeah, and you look at it. Again, he played career high in snaps with 550 this year. That's the most he's ever played. He had 3 sacks this season. He just gave them a consistent presence that we didn't have, and he kind of helped keep them, in it to the end there. He was the only defensive lineman that played all 16 games.
Yeah,
and so when you look at it from that perspective, it's just one of those situations where he's going to be overlooked, but he was a really important addition because of the fact that he stayed healthy and contributed every single game, where that just didn't happen very much for the Arizona Cardinals along the defensive line.
For me, let's go biggest surprise. I don't think there was a more surprising player in terms of production as Dennis Gardeck. I have, like, seriously, the insane production that he had as a pass rusher, 7 sacks in 93 defensive snaps, is ridiculous. And I honestly, it feels fluky, and he'll probably never have a season like that ever again in his career. But what a surprise, and what a relief, considering the loss that they had in Chandler Jones, and then losing Devon Kennard in terms of production, because he lost those games, and then he sort of fell behind the depth chart once they got Marcus Golden. Dennis Gardeck was a revelation this year.
Yeah, he really was, and I think that's outside of Hassan Reddick, I don't think there's another player that warrants that much in terms of surprise. And
Right, like Hassan Reddick was a surprise. Dennis Gardeck, were you what? Like, come on, like he was like Reddick. At least you knew that he played it. He was a pass rusher in college. He had production that way. I mean, Dennis Gardeck was an undrafted kid. I didn't know much. I didn't realize that he had played the edge before. He's super undersized, special teams, but he just plays with this. Like, you talk about the motor with which Marcus Golden plays, and Gardeck matches that at least and wins more.
Yeah, and so I would agree with you on Gardeck.
Now, this is the hard one. This is where you don't want to be the hyperbole. For you, what was the biggest disappointment? Who was the biggest disappointment this year?
For me, I think this one's easy. And there's a lot of options. But I think the biggest disappointment was Zane Gonzalez. You had a guy that everybody kind of thought, hey, you've got your kicker. They paid him, a good chunk of change. They gave him a second-round tender, 3.3. Yeah, just under $3.3 million. A 25-year-old. They basically have their guy. They have their kicker of the future, and then he comes out and just puts up a really bad season, and that was, that was unfortunate. And he didn't miss a lot of kicks, but all the kicks he missed outside of the first one against San Francisco were important kicks in important times of the game.
Right.
And that's what you don't want and can't have from your kicker. And so I think that's, I think for me it was Zane, and it's just unfortunate because I thought that he, we talked about it. We thought they had kind of figured out that position, and now it looks like it's back to the drawing board.
Right. Yeah. The guy that they signed, Brett Maher. But for me, I mean, there's a number of guys you could choose, and a lot of it is simply just because of injury. Like Jordan Phillips was not impactful. He was solid when he played, but the fact that he couldn't stay on the field. Jalen Thompson's injury early, that was disappointing, but he didn't play disappointing. Patrick Peterson wasn't great. Sometimes he was not good, but he was okay. So that was disappointing in the fact that he said he promised his best season yet. We did not get. I mean, he had more interceptions than he's had in a while, but that was disappointing. Gonzalez is my pick too, though. I almost go with Christian Kirkman. He had a couple of good games, but there were far too many games he was invisible, and just he needed to be a more impactful player this year, because there's another thing. You could almost say, and I almost put Andy Isabella up there as well because of how he had an impactful game early on in Detroit, and then just the fact that he went from he got the Keyshawn treatment at the end of last year, where he wasn't even active on game days, and then you go to week 17 when they don't have Fitz or Christian, and they still don't play him more than 3 snaps. And when Fitz came back from COVID, that was kind of the reason why that's the reason that Kingsbury gave that Andy Isabella was put inactive, because Fitz was playing. So I'm going to agree with you that the biggest disappointment was Zane Gonzalez, but there are some definite candidates to go there as well.
Yeah, and I think Isabella is a big one. I would say Jordan Hicks would have been a big one. He did not play well this year. Patrick Peterson, but they were, at least most of the time, they were out there and they played. Like you said with Isabella, he wasn't even getting on the field at the end, and that's disappointing in and of itself. But yeah, I think Zane's misses just linger, and loom so large at this point that it can't be anything but disappointing how he finished.
Correct. Like if anything else, missing that kick in New England cost them the playoffs. I mean, if you look at if you can break it down to one play that if it goes the right way, they're in the playoffs, it's that one. It's that play. He kicks that game-winning field goal. Then they're not in the situation where they're having to go down the field, and maybe they tie it. But they're probably not in this scenario. They're not coming. The defense isn't disappointed coming back on the field after having the game basically won. It was deflating. So we'll wrap up this show. It's a supersize. It's not just the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, but it's the best hour and a half hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We'll wrap this up. We should be back next week. We will begin the off-season content, because there's a whole bunch of that to go on over the next few weeks, and then we get into the draft and all that stuff. So we still have plenty of shows to come. That's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up, See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms, so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, Rise Up, See Red.